History in print. Every story you're about to hear is real.
In March of 1902, the Kentucky Gazette reported that arsenic had claimed a life in Lexington, and no one yet could say whose hand had held the poison. Good evening, this is History in Print. Tonight, Lexington, Kentucky. The year is 1902. Lexington was a city of tobacco and horses and old money. It was a place where men of standing knew one another's names, where the courts were supposed to hold, where the papers were supposed to say what was true. That spring, the Kentucky Gazette was printing stories that suggested none of those things could be counted on anymore. The Gazette's report on the arsenic death was blunt. A person had died. The death had been treated as major news. Whether it was murder, accident, or something else entirely, the record does not fully say. The victim's name, damaged in the surviving text, has not come down to us whole. What the paper made clear was this: Lexington's authorities were scrutinizing the case. The city was watching. What the papers didn't print was any reassurance that justice would follow. Because in the same weeks that a body lay in the mortuary, Lexington's own mayor was publishing an open letter in the Gazette, warning that corruption had taken root in the city's political life. He named New York, he named Pittsburgh. He said Lexington had been brought low. He called what was coming a day of reckoning, a suspicious death. A mayor sounding an alarm in public print. These were not separate stories, they were the same story. A city whose institutions were already under strain before the worst of 1902 had even arrived. The morning of March 5, 1902, a compositor set type at the Kentucky Gazette. The proof sheets told their story before the ink dried. Lexington was not a city at peace with itself. It sat mid-sized and proud on the bluegrass, built on commerce and bourbon and a Civil War memory that had never fully healed. But the papers that week told a different story than the city liked to tell about itself. On that same March 5th, the Gazette carried word of a raid on the Harris Distillery near the Virginia border. A posse had ridden in armed. The men guarding the operation were ready. Weapons were drawn. When it was over, 2 men lay wounded and in chains. Others from the raiding party were wounded as well. The contraband equipment was seized on the spot. 3 days later, the Gazette's March 8th edition carried something darker still. A headline, 4 words, read simply, "Death by Arsenic." A body. A mortuary. Lexington authorities scrutinizing what appeared to be a suspicious and shocking death. The victim's full name was lost to damaged type, but the story was not buried. It was given prominent placement. The city was watching. What the papers didn't print plainly was what the mayor had already said in public. He issued an open letter in that same March 5th Gazette, naming New York and Pittsburgh as warnings, not examples. He declared his own city had been brought low. He called corruption rampant. He warned that a day of reckoning was approaching. A sitting mayor, indicting his own government in print. This was the city that within weeks would face a disaster demanding answers from those very institutions. When accountability was needed most, the machinery of trust in Lexington was already broken. The Gazette kept setting type. The week was not finished. In the week of March 5, 1902, the Kentucky Gazette was not covering one crisis. It was covering 3. The first came from the Virginia border. The Harris Distillery had been running its operation when a raiding posse arrived with weapons drawn. The men guarding the distillery did not stand down. A According to the Kentucky Gazette, a fierce confrontation broke out. 2 men at the distillery were wounded and brought to jail. Several members of the raiding party were reported wounded as well. The contraband equipment was seized on the spot. The distillery workers had been surprised mid-operation. They had not gone quietly. What the papers didn't print was any accounting of who had been warned, who had not, and why a fortified Kentucky border operation required that much armed resistance to dismantle. The record does not say. 3 days later, on March 8th, the Gazette turned to something quieter and in some ways darker. A story headlined "Death by Arsenic" appeared prominently in that edition. A fatality had occurred the previous week. The paper treated the death as major local news. Lexington authorities had taken notice. The victim's full name is lost to OCR damage, but the tone of the coverage was unmistakable. This was not an accident anyone was prepared to accept at face value. A body had been brought to a mortuary. Questions had followed it there. A gunfight on a hillside. A poisoning in the city. And the week was not yet finished. This was the week Lexington read about. Not in retrospect, not as history assembled later, but in real time, one edition after another, folded and passed hand to hand. The Gazette was not describing an unusual stretch of days. It was describing the city as it actually ran. Violence at the margins, suspicion at the center, and institutions expected to answer for all of it, even when they could not. That is the weight those pages carried. A distillery raid was a law enforcement matter. An arsenic death was a matter for the coroner. Each story had its proper channel, its proper authority. But in March 1902, Lexington had already been told by its own mayor that those channels ran through corrupt hands. The question of who could be trusted to investigate was not a philosophical one. It was the week's most practical problem. The Gazette kept printing. Each story demanded accountability from somewhere. Not every story found it. 3 crises, 1 week, 1 paper. The city was not quiet. The explosion had cost lives, it had cost property. But the accounting that followed raised a harder question. Whether the institutions meant to deliver justice were capable of delivering it at all. That spring, Lexington's mayor stepped forward, not in a speech, not in a closed chamber. He published a formal open letter in the Kentucky Gazette for every citizen to read. In it, he drew a direct and unflinching comparison between Lexington and the most corrupt cities in America, New York and Pittsburgh among them. He warned that the city had been brought low. He declared that a day of reckoning was approaching. The letter was not diplomatic. It was a public accusation aimed squarely at the men running the city. The Gazette printed it without flinching. Then the paper turned to the county court judge. The record showed this. The previous judge, a lawyer of full practice and high reputation, had held that seat at a salary of $1,100 a year. The man who replaced him had no standing at the bar. He raised his own salary, and then the day before leaving office, he raised it again to $3,000 per annum. The Gazette called it plainly what it was, plunder, and it asked who exactly these men thought they answered to. The answer, it seemed, was no one. The grand jury of Fayette County said as much. That spring, the jury filed a public charge against the court itself, against Judge Lackey, accusing the bench of failing to protect jurors from personal inducements and political pressure. The jurors had been impaneled to pursue justice. They found themselves abandoned by the court that had called them. And on that same page of the May 10th Gazette, alongside the corruption charges, alongside the grand jury's broadside, sat an unresolved item the paper headlined simply as the library mystery. What it meant, the record does not say. The papers printed the explosion. They also printed a city that could not govern itself. 50 years passed, then 50 more. The mines fell quiet. The distillery raids became stories men told on porches. The mayor's open letter, the doubled salary, the grand jury's abandoned charge, all of it settled into the ground the way old things do. Lexington grew into the undisputed capital of Kentucky's horse industry, a university city, a place that had moved past its fractures or buried them deep enough not to notice. But the papers survived. The Kentucky Gazette, the Bluegrass Blade, preserved on microfilm, held now at the Library of Congress, where a researcher can thread a reel through a reader and watch a century resolve on a small gray screen. What comes into focus is not a city in crisis. It is a city that simply kept going, through corruption and explosions and infant deaths and infidel editors and plague ships and floods. The institutions of 1902 Lexington did not hold the line. The newspapers did. They kept printing. That is what they left behind.
Every word you just heard came from the original newspapers. Subscribe to History in Print, a new story from the American